All right, hi everyone. I'm Vlad. I'm going to talk about why and how companies should pay open source maintainers. We'll get into that. So first of all, I'll just give you a little tiny bit about myself. I work on software and philosophy that contributes in some way to the public good. Um, right now, I'm mainly working on the open source pledge on FOSDEM, and you're going to find out in due time what that is. I'm also doing a PhD at the University of Edinburgh in the philosophy of exploitation mainly, and we'll see how that sort of ties into it. In case anyone's interested, I'm also a cat sitter, so, come up to me, let me know. Right, so here's the general gist of what I'm talking about. I just want to talk about a couple of sort of ideas and also technologies that we might be able to use to make the open source ecosystem more sustainable. However, these are just some ideas and I'm keen to discuss them with you. I don't have all the answers. It's just that we have to really make more progress with this stuff because it's important. So, almost all companies, the measurements vary, but almost all companies use open source software. Cat Whitaker did this great article a while back, and he said that he approximated that open source software creates around $853 billion of value yearly. And if we didn't have critical open source software, we can watch YouTube videos without like FFmpeg. You can use your phone to talk to your friends and family. Can get your medical records. Certainly can't go to Mars, right? Nevertheless, a lot of software is kept going by unpaid maintainers. Here we're seeing a tweet from FFmpeg saying, our software is used in these like incredibly critical applications, and we just don't get, FFmpeg does get some grants, but we just don't get paid by the corporations that get a huge amount of value from our software. This becomes a problem when we look into things like security issues, right? So if this open source software that we rely on so much is vulnerable, it can lead to really bad stuff when it's a huge part of our global supply chain. And so we saw some close calls with exit utils, with log4shell. These are vulnerabilities, just exit utils if you're not familiar, hugely important open source project. The maintainer is kind of doing an enormous amount of work, gets burnt out and says, hey, can someone help me maintain this project? Someone shows up and says, sure, I'll help you. But they're a bad guy and they, introduce this awful exploit into this thing that everyone uses. So that's scary. The reason this is a problem for sustainability when it comes to paying maintainers is that, maintainers need to pay rent. If you don't get paid, it's very difficult to dedicate time, to justify dedicating time to these projects that are often a lot of work to maintain. And that puts, it's not very nice for the maintainer, and also it puts the project they maintain at risk because, there might not be someone to maintain it. It might be improperly maintained and so on. All right, why don't maintainers get paid? Now, basically, money gets exchanged on the market's exclusionary. So if you come and stay in my hotel, I will say, hey, you can stay in my hotel if you pay me, whatever the fee is, if you pay me $100. Now, that means that I have to withhold what I'm making or what I own until you pay me an appropriate amount of money. Of course, I could just give you the hotel room, but then that wouldn't be a market transaction, and it's not usually how it happens. Open source software is very much not like that. Some might say the whole point of open source software is that it's not exclusionary, that you have the right to sort of redistribute and use and change in all the software, but also you're not supposed to stop anyone from having those freedoms, right? So in a sense, it goes counter to the market. Problem is you pay rent on the market, so now, I want to talk a little bit about what open source actually is if it's not sort of part of the market economy in that sense. Some people say it's a gift economy. I think, maybe, but, I don't think it's a gift economy right now. Okay, what is a gift economy? So a gift economy, in a gift economy, what usually happens is goods get exchanged in sort of, well, I have a little list here, in sort of a directed and personalized way, right? So I give you something that's sort of symbolic of my relationship to you. There's some kind of expectation of reciprocity, and that sort of maintains our relationship with our exchange. That's not really how things happen in open source, especially because, when you create open source software, you're not giving it to a particular person. You're not saying, hey, I made this for you. Here's my gift to you. It could be something like that in the future, but that's not really what's happening right now. Missing reciprocity, yeah. And then the other thing is, some people say, well, it's based on esteem. There's for sure a component of esteem in open source software, but it's not really the case that it's a sort of an exchange of esteem. Like, I don't give you the software and then I get esteem in return and that's it, right? There's many reasons why people create open source software beyond esteem. Now you might say, if you're Adam Smith, you might say, well, why would anyone make open source software in this case? It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. And, that's true. Obviously, people are not irrational in that sense. People who make open source software do get something out of it, obviously. And so, some people say, well, this is contradictory, right? Because if it's not an exchange, what are you getting out of it? So I guess what I'm saying is you might be getting something out of it. It's just not an exchange. You're not getting something from sort of a direct transaction in that sense. And again, this is sort of an idea that I'm happy to sort of continue workshopping, but I think open source production might be something like solidary meaningful work, because there's a lot of goods that we get from work that we don't get from the transaction itself, right? So what I mean by solidary is, famously open source developers like scratch their own itch. And so, you might be using a piece of software and then you realize that there's something missing and you create that sort of feature or whatever because you would like it. But also I think there's this component of, I wish we all had this thing. Here's something that I think is important. Wouldn't it be nice if we all had it? And, I would like if also other people worked in that way so that when there's something that I'm lacking, someone else can step up and help contribute that. So in this sense, I think it's solidary. And I also think it's meaningful. This is a long list and I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically there's all sorts of things that we get from work aside from, the money. We get autonomy, so the ability to create something that's self-directed and then we put ourselves into, self-development, developing your skills, making some kind of social contribution where you feel like you're helping others around you, getting purpose, something to sort of make you get out of bed. And then of course the recognition. So I guess the sort of point I'm trying to make here is I think there's a lot of goods that people get from open source production other than exchange, goods that are exchanged. Now, some might say, well, cool, it's solidary, meaningful work. Doesn't that sound nice? But you're not going to get paid because that's, not, we don't pay people based on how solidary and meaningful their work is. Okay, that there's a point there. Thing is, obviously, there are good reasons. You can't just say, well, all those open source people, we should just sort of put them in companies and pay them if they want to get paid. I think there's good reasons to produce software in the way that the open source ecosystem produces it, even if it means that sort of currently that is incompatible with the market. You obviously get a much larger base of contributors. So, there's only so many people in a company. There's only so many people you can hire. And there's a high transaction cost associated with that. There's friction there. Whereas when you have an international base of contributors, the transaction cost is very low. Anyone can help. And often that means that someone who's very specialized in the thing that's being built is the person that steps up to do the work. And this doesn't happen. So, well, it happens sometimes, but it's much more difficult. The transaction cost is much higher in companies. There's a massive deduplication of work for some things. Obviously, there are some things that we produce that are specific to a certain firm, a certain product. There's so much stuff that is, used by a lot of different companies. And so if they all were to produce that separately, that would be extremely inefficient. So that's a good reason to do things in this way. And again, this is really tied to the economics, right? It's more difficult to have this deduplication of work if you have the high transaction costs of having to, hire people and so on. And, so a more minor point, but in a lot of open source projects, the fact that production is done in an open source way means that production is much more responsive to user needs, because in open source production, often the people contributing are also users. And so they really understand how the product works, as opposed to, a developer in a company who might not be using the thing that they're making. So they understand it from the user perspective way less. It's not, so this is not just me saying it. This is also Microsoft in 1998 saying commercial quality can be achieved or exceeded by open source software projects, right? So this is sort of a thing that's acknowledged. Now, taking all of this into account, nevertheless, maintainers aren't getting paid. Why should companies specifically pay maintainers? And I have sort of two main arguments. The first one's the moral argument, and this is more sort of an invitation for you to think about it than anything else, right? You know, we can say that open source software is a digital public good. What does that mean? I won't get into the weeds too much, but you know, we have sort of three main things. If you work on curl or, you know, substitute, you know, curl, I'm just saying like a really important open source package. If you make an improvement to curl, everyone in the world benefits from it, right? To different degrees, but everyone benefits. Curl is non-exclusionary in that I can't, you know, stop you from using curl. I can't take curl away from you. You know, it's open source. And it's also non-rivalrous in that if I use curl, there isn't less curl for you. So for example, if I do a lot of fishing and I take a lot of fish out of the ocean, there's less fish for you. But if I use curl, I'm not stopping anyone from using curl, right? So that's just, you know, generally what people mean by a public good. However, some people benefit a lot more from curl than other people, or, you know, equivalent open source projects. So companies that base their business model on curl get a huge amount of value out of curl. Again, we're imagining. So, you know, that we should also take that into account, that sort of benefit is not evenly distributed. So one kind of argument that someone might make is to say, hey, dear CEO that's using my software, you know, all these critical maintainers generate so much value for your company. And this is value that, you know, you get the most value, or you get a sort of a really large share of the value from this project. The people making it don't get that value because they're not able to pay rent off of the development of that project. Wouldn't it be nice, right, for you to pay something back to the people that enable you to sort of make use of this value? Now, I'm not saying this as sort of this thorough moral argument because I think that's sort of philosophically really difficult. But I wondered how many people this speaks to, right? So Martha Nussbaum says that emotions are suffused with intelligence and discernment and judgments about important things. So often we get a hint about what things we should think about and what things are important, and we get some information for the emotions that we feel. And so this is just an invitation sort of to everyone to think, do you empathize with the situation that the maintainer is in? But of course, again, this isn't a thorough argument. So here's my second argument, which is the business argument. What, you know, by business argument, I mean something like, hey, look, you know, CEO or business owner, if you do something, either you will profit or you will avoid loss, right? So it's sort of prudential, it's wise to do this thing. Now, we saw earlier, right, the benefits of open source production. And so the companies using that open source software also benefit from the way that open source production is organized. So if your company pays the maintainers that it depends on, that software that you're relying on, that open source software, you're going to be able to benefit by enabling that larger base of contributors, those more specialized contributors, that efficient production. And importantly, if your company relies on this, you're going to know that by paying the people who make the software, you have more sustainability and security in the software stack that you rely on and are enabling this more efficient model of production. And yeah, you know that you can keep relying on the packages that you depend on. So it offers the company that's paying the maintainers stability as well. There's also a little pleasant marketing bonus there if you're a company, which is, you know, this sort of open source funding is something that we're still figuring out. If you decide to pay maintainers and sort of lead this movement forward, there's a marketing bonus there in which, you know, if your customers are comparing you to a competitor, they might say, well, these guys are forward thinking, right? These guys are sort of leading open source funding, so I trust them more, right? Because they're thought leaders in this sector. Okay. Those are my arguments for why. Okay, let's talk about how, because it's also not easy to actually go and pay maintainers, right? And also, who is getting paid? I'm not going to answer all these questions. I'm just going to say a few things, right? For one thing, I'm talking specifically about company funding, right? There's a big difference between aggregate fund, you know, I just made up the word, aggregate funding. So ecosystems, Andrew Nesbitt is doing amazing work there. Sovereign Tech Fund, you know, I love this stuff. It's great. This is basically saying we're going to take something like tax money and we're going to analyze the entire open source ecosystem, and then we're going to find out who globally needs to get funding. I love it, right? But what I'm talking about is company funding. So companies that use open source software paying maintainers more or less directly. And so that's Open Source Pledge and FANGSTF. So let's talk about that a little bit. Open Source Pledge, you might have seen this, is sort of a cultural initiative that I help maintain. It's funded by Sentry. Thank you, Sentry. And sort of the ask is to say, hey, look, if you want to be a member of the pledge, we ask that you pay $2,000 per developer employed at your company per year to, any open source projects or foundations. You can choose who you want to pay. However, we recommend that you pay you pay for the maintenance of the projects that you depend on. Payments go directly to maintainers, so we don't handle any funds. You might have seen sort of the marketing campaign that we had, and so I know some people saw the billboards. It's kind of a little bit provocative when it comes to companies that
Just say that.
yeah maybe don't pay the maintainers they depend on. So far we've raised almost $2.5 million. Our members have paid maintainers that amount over the last year, and there's 30 member companies, and we're so happy to keep getting new members. Here are some member companies. So, you can check out the website. So this is the general idea. This is sort of the cultural aspect of it, right? This is where we're saying, hey, it should be normal based on, some of the arguments that I just said. It should be normal for companies to pay the maintainers they depend on, right? Now, if I'm a company, the question then becomes, okay, cool. Here's $1 million. Okay, what do you want me to do with it, right? Like, who do I pay? What do I do concretely, right? And there's the question also of like, who should I give it to? Now, generally you want to say, well, if you depend on some you depend on some projects more than others, right? And so you would like to fund those. There are some criticality metrics. So I've cited one thing here. In my opinion, we can do more research here. In my opinion, these criticality metrics are just sort of a proxy for how much the thing is being used, right? So let's focus on usage for now. However, maybe I'm a company, I depend on thousands of projects. How am I going to know which projects I depend on the most in a scalable way and with a minimum amount of effort, so I don't have people sort of, looking through my code every time I update something? Something that would be nice is if you had sort of, the company has this code base, and then the code base, you could give it to this service that sort of confidentially reads your code and spits out some dependency info about what your usage is. That's ThanksDev. So basically, just, if you're not familiar with ThanksDev, ThanksDev is the service where, companies or really anyone can sign in. You give us access to whatever repositories you want to give us access to. We sort of analyze the code, and then we say, hey, here's who you depend on the most, and here's an easy way to, depending on sort of the weighting of each project, directly pay those maintainers, right? So you can pay the maintainers through the platform, right? Maintainers can also sort of sign up and say, hey, I'm happy to be paid for ThanksDev and so on. Now, the question remains, how is this money split up, right? Now, this is sort of what ThanksDev looks like right now, more or less, is like if you give $100, it gets split up like this. So if you sort of do the numbers, the top row is direct dependency. So let's say the $100 is your project. And then the top row is things that you have in your package JSON or whatever, right? And then the lower things are sort of second level dependencies, which are dependencies of your dependencies. And things get split up like this. So, okay, cool. You might see a problem, which is, if you use LeftPad and Node Postgres, obviously Node Postgres is really important, and LeftPad is like not so important. And so if you split that up into two, you're giving $50 to each, and that doesn't seem like the best way to split things. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be sort of saying something about that. We just saw with the previous talk, someone saying, hey, look, I'm giving to, with the copy public and the XWiki stuff, I'm paying maintainers, but I want to vote on who should be getting paid and manually adjust and so on. You can do this in ThanksDev today, right? So you can say, here are my dependencies, don't pay some projects more, and so on. So that's fine. The problem is we've heard from a lot of people that they just want to say, look, here's, again, like $100,000, figure it out for me. I don't want to spend time clicking around, right? So here's an idea. Instead of relying on what's in the package JSON and the other manifests, and sort of just weighting payments based on that, we could do some kind of static analysis of the code base to get a bit more accurate information. That's sort of the general principle. Here's one way to do that. It might not be the best way, but again, let's see. is, for one thing, it would be good to measure some kind of coupling metric between each of the dependencies and my code, right? So if I use a dependency and it's not so tightly coupled to my code, that means it's sort of more trivial to replace. If I use a dependency and it's very tightly coupled, the replacement cost is very high. And so it stands to reason that I probably should give that dependency a bit more money. Here's like a super basic demo of what something like that might look like, right? So here's just some, pretend code. If we look at where I use Node Postgres, obviously I'm importing it, and then I'm, calling some function from the package and putting it into a binding, and all of the variables that end up depending on that DB variable, we can say that have sort of been touched by Postgres, right? So we can have some kind of metric like this and say wherever something from Postgres ends up making a difference to the code, whatever, we can count those statements, let's say, right? And in this sort of toy example, 7 out of 8 statements depend on Postgres. Now, left pad, on the other hand, 3 out of 8 statements depend on left pad. So it's, in this simple example, less essential. So we can create a score out of that. Now, the other thing is, it's not just that the left pad is less critical to my project specifically. Left pad is also way less complex than Node Postgres. So in general, if you had to rewrite left pad from scratch, it would be fine. If you had to rewrite Node Postgres, not so much, right? So we would ideally like to have some kind of metric of complexity for each package. I'm not going to get into that, right? Let's just imagine we have a metric to measure package complexity, right? And then let's just say, well, whatever score we get, we need to make sure it's between 0 and 1. So let's say we get all of the complexity scores for all the packages. We take the highest one, and then we divide by that highest one, right? Here's a table. It's a lot of numbers. We're going to go through it, okay? First row, you have the coupling between each of the 2 packages and my code base. We got sort of 87%, 37%, whatever, right? So that's sort of the number that corresponds to how tightly Node Postgres and left pad, respectively, correspond to my code base. The second row is how complex is Node Postgres, how complex is left pad. We just made those numbers up, but imagine you have some kind of good metric. What we can then do is we need to combine those 2 numbers in some way. We're just going to multiply them, whatever. And so that gives us one score that combines those 2 numbers. The thing is, we'd like that score to be out of 1, right? Not out of 1, but to add up, of course, to add up to 1, so that we can sort of do it as a percentage. And so we have that in the proportional score sort of by dividing by the sum. And then what you can end up with, for example, is by this calculation that I made up, Postgres would get $95 and left pad would get $5. So that seems like a good result. So this sort of makes me believe that maybe this is something that we should look into more, because static analysis could give us better information about which dependency should get how much money, right? So this is sort of what you end up with as you get $5 to left pad and 95 to no Postgres. That's sort of almost it. I'd love to hear what you guys think. I think we might have time for like 1 or 2 questions, but I also don't like sort of the rush dynamic of the questions. So please come up to me later if you want to talk about it. Other than that, if you go to this handy link, I'll leave it up for a second. There's an issue tracker that I made because I know some people might have sort of similar questions, or, maybe we want one place to sort of consolidate like a longer discussion because, your feedback is valuable. So if you go there, there's just this link to this like Codeberg issue tracker, so you can make an issue and then we can talk about it. Very importantly, I have one confession to make. I made open source pledge and thanks dev stickers. They're really beautiful. I made too many stickers. Please help. The stickers are here. Take some for your friends. Take like 5 of them. It's fine, okay? Please. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Maybe, okay, yes, hello?
Hi, thanks for a really incredible talk. I have 2 concerns. The first one is it seems like you're solving social problems with technical solutions. Why don't you just ask the developers at the company if they have 100,000, send out a little voting thing, people click on a couple of things and boom, you have a good idea. And the other one is $2,000 per developer is way too little. 5% at Linux, like that's the minimum, and that's what I tell companies.
So I'll start with the first one. So the first question, if I'm understanding it correctly, is why not ask the people at the company who have more information about the dependencies what they think, because they have that domain knowledge, instead of sort of trying to find a technical solution that's just going to approximate what people know about the importance of the dependency. Is that right?
it's also the gaming aspect, right?
Right.
Your
Yes.
technology is going to be game.
Right. So it's, mitigating people gaming the metrics. I think that's absolutely true. I think we need to do more for that, and I absolutely agree. I think the reason that it's good to have some kind of computational solution is, again, I've heard from like a lot of companies that they're saying like, hey man, I just want you decide for me. But I do agree that maybe there needs to be a little bit of pushback on that cultural change aspect to say, hey guys, no, let's have a conversation. So yeah, I take that point. And then the second point is, you said $2,000 per developer is not enough. Yep. Right. I think it's, we're really trying to straddle a line in between getting something that meaningfully brings change to maintainers and something that companies are willing to do. As you scale that number up to a lot of employees, companies get more and more reluctant. So we are thinking about, whether that is the best number, but I think that's sort of the compromise that we've reached for now, but it is not perfect. Yeah. Andrew?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So we actually use ThankSteph in the past. I'm not using it anymore because it was too painful to manually adjust all these things, and because Sindre saw who's popped up at the top of all the dependency charts every with the ecosystem. But yeah, we suggested something similar. We need to produce a response anyway, and we'd like to produce like an open bomb, because all of this is also missing things like VLC, Firefox, Thunderbird, and layers 2 that don't appear on any. So that was our big problems actually. We like to spend money, but it's too hard. And this only solves. Let's have. I like it. Yeah, I already popped Adriana. Yeah. So yeah, but I like it.
Right. So how should I best summarize your comment for the audience?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So basically, there are still a lot of limitations to strategies like ThankSteph, and we need to work on how to solve things that are not visible in the manifest, really. Yeah. Right.
Upload an S-bomb.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I take that comment. Yeah. Hello. Yeah. So yes. Oh, Andrew. Yes. Finally. Yes.
The measure is financially incentivizing Leftpad to make their code much more complex. In fact, is like, oh, most people, especially projects that are very like done, they're not necessarily going to do that. But we're already seeing people start to realize, and if the algorithm is open source, it's very easy to reverse engineer how to do that. We've got a great thing with open source where there's no barriers to entry. It doesn't cost me to publish a new version of a thing. If we start to financially incentivize the algorithm that sends money automatically, we also need to consider the gamification and how we don't destroy everything that is good in the free and open source world. The process.
Yeah, so Andrew's saying, hey, look, these metrics can be very easily gamed, and not only can they be gamed, but they might be incentivizing people to prioritize the wrong things. If you use like whatever measure of complexity, like Leftpad could just add like 15 trillion for loops, and then you could say, whoa, there's so many paths through the code, man, it's crazy. So, yeah, I agree that's a problem, and I don't know. But yeah. Thank you so much. I think we're out of time. I'm so sorry that this it has to be so quick. I really would have loved to hear all of your questions, but if you go back here, please say hi. Okay, thank you so much.